Hi, Lou here to talk about the system and the psychological in game design. Now, I address this at considerable length in my game design book, but I found I haven't talked about it in my public videos. So let's take some examples. Chess and Go versus poker. Chess and Go are heavily system games. They are in fact puzzles that are too complicated for people to actually solve. But any two-player perfect information game is a puzzle. And such things are strongly system-oriented because puzzles are all system. Now, many games are not, especially opposed games that incorporate uncertainty. Low player interaction games tend to be systems, and high player interaction games tend to be psychological, unless they're only for two players. You can think of this as, are you playing the game or against the game, or you're trying to optimize the game, or are you playing against other players? Diplomacy, a game of negotiation, has a system, but the main part of the game is psychological. Even poker has a system, but it's a very simple one, and it's heavily psychological. Now, you can play poker according to the percentages of the system, but the people who are most successful are the ones who bluff. They, in effect, go against the system and rely on psychology to beat the other players. Some people talk about game state or board state. That's about the system, as opposed to the psychological, which is what's in the minds of the players. Board or game state is okay if the game is two-player or one player, and you play according to game theory style, which is, briefly, you play as though the other player is playing perfectly and maximize your minimum gain. If they don't play perfectly, you're even better off. But especially when you get into games for more than two people, this just isn't going to work. I recall particularly a critic of Britannia who said all he had to do was know the board state and he would do fine. And in fact, he would have done very poorly, because what matters is what's in the minds of the players. It's a four-player game. More examples. Gunboat Diplomacy, as it's called, is an attempt to make diplomacy, which is a supremely psychological game with a system component, into a purely system games. No negotiation is allowed in Gunboat, to the extent that in one case players tape their mouths shut. Of course, even then there were ways to negotiate by gesture and eyes. When you hear someone disparage negotiation as, quote, a popularity contest, or, quote, politics, unquote, you probably have a systems gamer, somebody who doesn't want to deal with the psychological. System gamers often don't want people messing up their game. And that's very common, especially with single-player video games. So to kind of summarize, games with low player interaction almost always lean strongly to the system side. Because, after all, if you're not dealing with the other players, you only have the system left to deal with. Those with high player interaction almost always lean to the psychological side, unless they are two players, and especially if they are two-player games with perfect information, nothing hidden and nothing uncertain. In the end, systems attract those who think games are all math, and the psychological attracts those who think games are about people. And always keep in mind, a puzzle is the extreme of a systems game. Now, not surprisingly, people who like heavy systems games often don't like heavy psychological games, and vice versa. It's almost like two different species. It is always fascinating how many different points of view there are about game playing. Thanks for listening.